I've been in Toronto since January 1st, 1969, and I came over here originally to pursue some beer commercials, which I had previously recorded in London with some new colleagues that I met, Doug Riley and Mort Ross. And unfortunately, they couldn't use them. When they got here, there was some issues, political issues that went down, and they had to be re-recorded. So I, in conversation, suggested that I might come over and redo them, and ended up in Toronto and loved it here, and met a lot of great people, a lot of great musicians, and used a studio or two in town that was quite behind in terms of technical excellence that I was used to in London at the time. You know, we were pretty cutting edge, independent studio at Olympic. And so we sat around after a few drinks and said, you know, why don't we do something here and put something together? And we did. So I moved here in '69, and during that year we put Toronto Sound together and equipped it with some cutting-edge gear and a console from England, from Cadac, and we opened in November of that year, and then proceeded to record quite a number of hits, Canadian hits, and of course the industry was going through a lot of changes at that point with CanCon, and you know, records were starting to hit the American charts and the worldwide charts, so it was starting to become something here. So I was part of that. So, well, originally I came over. We did Motherlode. We actually signed Motherlode to a recording deal, and had a top 10 hit in the U.S. with When I Die. And then through the following 2 years, I guess, we Sweet City Woman by the Stampeders. We had Sun Goes By with Dr. Music. It's a long list. And then, of course, I started working with Rush, and we started to have some success there. And Max Webster. It's a longer list than I can remember, to be honest with you. Michel Pagliaro from Quebec did his first English record at Toronto Sound, or most of it. And so we did a fair share of the market. Speakers, undoubtedly, we were always looking for really accurate monitoring, and accurate monitoring was a very, very expensive thing to have back in the 70s, mid-70s, 80s. Now it's quite commonplace. I mean, you can buy a pretty darn good set of speakers that are reasonably accurate, you know, near-field monitors that you can make some fairly astute decisions on. So I think the speakers would be the biggest thing that I can think of. The first thing that comes to mind really was using an 8-track tape machine, which was sitting really doing nothing but gathering dust because we'd moved up to 24. So we had an 8-track machine. I used it as a tape delay. And I had all 8 tracks returning on the console, and I had a separate send to each one of the tracks. And then I fed the tracks into each other at varying degrees and created a real beautiful montage of sound in stereo. So different sounds would pop up in different parts of the stereo and repeat themselves in different places. It was pretty stunning. It was the only time I ever did it, but it was a lot of fun. I mix in a computer, not in the computer, but I use the computer for my mixing. So I don't use a digital console. I don't think I've never really had a digital console. I was tempted, but they were very, very expensive when they first came out. So I sort of shied away from it and stayed in the analog domain as far as the mixing went. But I've mixed to a digital source, like a hard drive or a digital tape recorder for, 30 years now. I started in 80. And that I found extremely helpful because I was always this is going to sound strange, but I was always upset about the fact that when I played my mixes back on analog tape, they never sounded the same as when I just recorded them, and it bugged me. So I was quite excited when the digital age came along and I could play something back, and I know this is very subjective and we could discuss it for hours, but it basically sounded the same, in as much as the mid-range had more clarity, I felt, and there was more separation in the lower end of the instruments, like bass drum and bass, and the bottom end of guitars. I could hear a little more clearly. It didn't get mushed together. So that was a pretty exciting time for me, and because it took a long time to develop. I mean, when I look back on what we first started working with, it wasn't really accurate enough, even though I felt it was a step in the right direction. But I hung in with it and went through maybe 20 or 30 different incarnations of digital recorders. And now, of course, we're recording not necessarily exclusively, but a lot of us are doing mixing digitally. But I still don't mix with a digital console. I have a digital analog setup, which I think, for me, makes a lot of difference. But again, another discussion.